I can't. There's some of these examples that you give of who this enemy was. I just have to read them. Every day for 3 months they tortured me, Azir recalled from where he sat, stranded on the Assyrian side of the shuttered Turkish border. But after a while, the torture just became routine. He was one of the thousands of prisoners arrested by ISIS for so-called crimes like wearing Western jeans or smoking a cigarette. But he was also one of a select few who had managed to claw their way out of the terrorist group's dungeons with all his limbs intact. Short of jail, liberated by opposing forces, such escapes were considered rare. Just another one, Nasra, another former captive. ISIS told us we will give you safety if you give up your weapons. But they lied to us. They took our weapons and they arrested us. Many of Nasra's fellow soldiers had since been executed, but many remained incarcerated. There was no rights or to attorneys, due process, trials, or even a phone call. He estimated that as many as 2,000 Iraqi armor soldiers had been slain since succumbing to ISIS over the past 2 years. He also estimated that 5,000 at that time remained in prison bowels across the country. The cages were so small, Nasra said, that their torsos were marked by the folds of skin and their limbs tinged blue from the hours of crouching, curled like a fetus in the womb. Women arrested by ISIS typically disappeared behind the prison's exterior, held separately from the men, and were often never seen again. Children are not exempt from the torment either. A large number of children have been arrested by ISIS. My friend Hassam, a member of the Syrian activist group Raqqa, is being slaughtered silently. He explained the most common charges are insulting Allah and cooperating with apostates. They are being tortured just like men, and some of them have died under torture. They torture children too, mostly flogging, beating on the hands and feet, and psychological torture. I was administered with electric shocks. My bones were broken. I was hung by my feet from the ceiling and beaten with my hands tied behind my back, said Ali, a professional in his mid-40s who had been arrested in the early days of the terrorist onslaught on suspicion of being an atheist. They swore on a Quran that I would be cut to pieces. You make a note here. You can take a life without killing. That's what torture does. Between the summers of 2015 and 2016, ISIS had been on an especially vicious rampage to compensate for the loss of seasoned soldiers, and had taken to drugging those it radicalized or forced into its lair. ISIS is using special tablets. The fighters take drugs and they don't know where they are or what they are doing. They are just shooting and fighting, one Kurdish intelligence official explained. They lose their minds. Some can be shot 20 times before they go down. That ominous drug was known as Captagon. Is that right? Mm-hmm. A methamphetamine-like variant of the banned pharmaceutical fentanyl. It was manufactured in copious quantities, primarily in Lebanon and neighboring Syria, where it was sold to ISIS through middlemen. It removes any barriers you would have to fighting. There is no second guessing. They just go out and kill.
It's still a very common battlefield drug. It often comes from Lebanon or Syria. And yeah, it's unfortunately it goes just beyond ISIS, but it's becoming a very common drug that a lot of militias and even government soldiers are sort of being given to give them that sense of invincibility, to have them go out there and do whatever they're told, and I think it really gained prominence under ISIS.
With little kids.
Yeah. Yep. It's drugging them up.
Among the ranks of captured, brainwashed, and drugged were scores of Yazidi boys whose minds had been twisted to turn against their own people. They had been propelled into training regimes that included Islamist indoctrination and weapons instruction. They had been forced into learning the finer points of beheading, forced into becoming suicide bombers, and into serving as human shields. Did your perception of evil change while you were there?
I think in the beginning, I perhaps had a little bit more of a black and white perspective on it, which I think, especially in the US, we tend to sort of think, which I think is completely wrong, but we tend to it always comes down to a religion thing. And that always is often painted as the motivating factor. And I think what I really learned for people that were joining ISIS, it was really one of 5 things or one of 10 things that was motivating them to join. And so I think the complexities for me really grew in that, because I suddenly started to see, and ISIS is absolutely evil, and that hasn't changed for me. But what I started to see was the complexities of how they got to that point and why they joined, and it wasn't so black and white really, and that majority of them really were joining more out of a necessity for survival than it necessarily was some kind of religious extremism. However, there was a difference between the ones that were coming, foreigners were coming, and they were often a lot more extreme in that respect. What I found for the Iraqis in particular that were joining was that a lot of them, it was, ISIS had come in and taken over their town or their village, and they still needed to feed their family. So those kind of complexities grew for me, and it was a lot harder to look at things in such sort of black and white terms.
Yeah, I think you're right that America definitely misses the point on that a lot. It was always, I still have conversations with people that will talk to me about, or they'll come at me about, we had no reason to be fighting the Iraqis. And I was like, hey, we were fighting alongside the Iraqis. They were literally going into the same buildings with us. That's what they were doing. That we weren't fighting against the Iraqis. We were fighting against the insurgents that were there. Same thing with the what you mentioned about, how am I going to feed my family? There's plenty of 14, 17, 19, 22-year-old young male Iraqis that wanted money. And how are they going to get money? Well, there's someone over here that's going to pay them $50 to go shoot an RPG at the coalition forces, and that's what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. And they weren't jihadists. They were little hoodlums, just like a little hoodlum in America. That's how are you going to make a living in America in some crappy city where you don't have any opportunities? Oh, I'm going to be a drug dealer, or I'm going to be a gangbanger because somebody's going to pay me, to go and carry this from here to there. It's an economic decision more than anything else. And even when they're talking about, if it's a religious thing, well, it can't be a religious thing because it's the actual Muslims fighting against the Muslims. It's not like it's not about that. Mm. And what the other crazy thing is, when you talk to people and, I would explain, well, we were working with oftentimes a majority Shia army, mm-hmm. and it would be hard for them to interact with the Sunnis, and people they don't even understand what you're talking about.
And that was a big, with ISIS is, you disband an entire, the Sunnis were very disbanded after Saddam, and yet they still had their weapons and they're out on the street and feeling, persecuted by the government. And so what are they going to do? They're going to band together. It was the same people. It wasn't anything new. I think ISIS was sort of looked at as this group that came out of nowhere and dropped from the sky. Well, no, they were always there. They just kind of came together at some point.
When you mentioned Baghdadi, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, al-Baghdadi, my task unit in Ramadi in 2006 went to go and capture or kill him. Mm-hmm. Had a mission to go capture, kill him, and didn't get him. It's actually the opening story. Leif Babin was the ground force commander on that operation. They got into a big gunfight because there was security there, which means he was probably in that vicinity. But you're right. Well, it's not. They didn't drop from the sky. Yeah. This was a guy that had been there and fought as an insurgent and was on the run and constantly trying to maneuver. And so, yeah, these people didn't drop from the sky. And, the other crazy thing that you can compare to a lot of bad situations in the world where what they want is there to be problems. What the insurgents want is to create division, right? Division, and they would go and bomb Shia mosques just to get the Shias to lash out at the Sunnis, and then the Sunnis they were trying to create a civil war. And it was very, very hard to walk that line and make sure that you're doing this in a proper way. And even when in Ramadi, when we got there in 2006, I thought we were just going to do a big sweep through like we did, like the Marines did in Fallujah. Just go and rubble every building and just run through it. And Maliki, the prime minister, who was a Shia, knew that if he did that, it would be bad. It would be bad. And so he said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it in a more sparing way, as with minimal force required. And that's what we did. There was still force required, but it was a lot less kinetic than Fallujah was. So, yeah, I'll tell you, but all that being said, the evil that's perpetrated is just absolutely horrific, and you capture it in this book. And what scares me the most about it is how easily people are swayed towards. It doesn't take much to push somebody over the line from being a normal person to beheading children, which is horrific. And I did one podcast on the My Lai massacre, and there was roughly 500 old men, women, and children, no military age males there at all. 500 murdered, raped, mutilated. And reading the interviews with the guys that perpetrated this, and you read their backgrounds, and you read where they came from, and you read what they did, we have to be on the lookout for this kind of stuff, because these guys committed heinous atrocities, equivalent of ISIS atrocities, and they were Americans that had crossed over the line.
Absolutely. And I really think, and this is something I found in Afghanistan, in Syria and Iraq, and in a lot of other places that we just don't give enough attention to, and that is government corruption and how much of these things are a symptom of that. If you have to pay someone every time you're going to go through a checkpoint, so that some policeman can line his pocket, if you see your leaders rolling around with in these fancy cars and big houses and Rolexes, and you're not, you can't get by, you're sweeping in the street and still not getting any services, then at some point it's going to make you angry. And when you're angry enough, I also think it's a big factor for joining a lot of these groups to sort of rise up against their own governments. And I think it's something that when I talk to officials about it, they're often so quick to throw up their hands. Oh, we can't do anything about that. That's just a systemic problem. Okay, but you're always going to be dealing with terrorism as a systemic problem from that problem, because corruption is just such a huge driver of it in every way, shape, or form. And I just think it's something that gets barely any attention when it's such a big reason why these groups exist and continue to exist and will continue to exist.
Yeah, you have that little bit of anger in the back of your mind that you're being oppressed, and then someone comes along and says, hey, you can fight that oppression with us, and I'm in. Let's do this.
Yeah.